Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. Thank you all for tuning in. And as always, I hope that you get what you need from today's conversation that I'm going to be having with my special guest, Nick Mueller. Nick comes to us from Ontario, and he is the general manager of a sports pub. And he also is a full-time caretaker for his elderly dad who has some health challenges. I am very excited to have you on today, Nick. Welcome and thank you for being willing to come on and share your story.
Well, no, thank you. The pleasure is all mine.
So I don't waste any time. Let's jump
Mm,
right in. You and
hmm
I had a few minutes to chat before we started recording the episode. And you're not coming here today really to talk about one significant loss. You had numerous losses that happened in a very short period of time.
Yeah, yeah, that's correct.
So you talked about losing a couple of uncles and your grandmothers, and then you had four beloved pets, your cats, and had to put your animals down,
Mm,
and you started to spiral into darkness. So let's talk about sort of that year where you were going through these losses and what was happening for you as this kind of domino effect of losing significant people and pets in your life.
yeah, so actually that's a quite the apt description of it. It really did feel like a domino effect. The build up to it was just generally speaking was not in a super great place in my life, just unhappy with being single, for example, wasn't super awesome, kind of stuck in a dead end job, which I always felt that I was better than, or at least I had more potential anyway. So leading up to all this, I was already a little bit dour and a little bit cynical. However, so as I was explaining to you earlier, the timeline is a little bit fuzzy, but roughly around, let's say, about a year and a half before COVID struck, this domino effect started to fall. Where at first I had lost one of my uncles, then one of my grandmothers, who hers was a particularly terrible blow because my mom had passed 2006, and her and I were really close, and this was her mom's mom. So I was really, really close with this particular grandmother, and it sort of, I guess, under the surface, it felt like losing my mom almost all over again. So that one was particularly harsh. But then I ended up, yeah, losing another uncle, then my other grandmother, then it feels so weird to say, but then my last cat, which in the grand scheme of things, it seems silly, but it was just sort of icing on the cake, sort of. And then to top it all off, we received the diagnosis from my dad, and it became pretty clear that he doesn't have much time left. So all said and done, this all kind of culminated within about a year and a half where
Mhm.
all of this happened. So it was just like, it was almost like every single time I got a chance to kind of get my feet under me and recover from the last staggering blow, another one would hit me, and it just eventually brought me into an extremely dark place, and I was not coping with it very well, to
Before
say the
we
least.
before we go there, are just a couple of questions. I think that lots of times people minimize the loss of their pets, and I'll never forget reading this article around people grieving their pet and how
Mm,
they can love their pets equal to the love they have for their children. And I have never had children, and I've only
mm,
had pets,
mm,
and so I know what losing a pet can do and what that grief looks like because they are so
yeah.
I mean, pets are therapeutic for a reason, right? I mean,
Oh,
well,
100%.
we
Yeah.
tell people to get a pet when they feel lonely
Yeah.
because they're sort of like, so
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that because I'm sure that when you had to put your cat guy and when you lived alone and these animals were they were your family, right? I mean, we
Yeah.
have to come home to our pets. We need to feed our pets. Our life rotates around our pets. So I just wanted to say that, not to minimize when you had to put that last pet down and you have had all of these losses and there is your buddy
Mm,
and you had to deal with that. And I think what's also important is that you were not in a great place before you started dealing with this domino effect.
Yeah.
So when you talk about spiraling into a dark place, then COVID hit, correct?
Yeah. So that was kind of another thing because yeah, it was, I mean, not like there's a great time for any of that to happen. However, COVID, you know, especially in the beginning, as you and your viewers can attest to, it was a very uncertain time. There was a lot of anxiety and isolation that came along with it. I mean, especially in the beginning because nobody really knew anything. We didn't really have, as much established science and data as we have now. So, I remember reading that, like, oh, it stays on surfaces for 2 years and don't touch your eyes, and it's killing people left and right. And at one point I was we're sanitizing our groceries, and it was just, there was so much to it. And I remember just at one point, I think this might have been maybe 3 or 4 months in, once it really started to get serious. Let's say, like, once they started shutting down the NBA and really people started going into lockdowns and all that, there was this almost acute, almost apocalyptic feel, because you just didn't know what tomorrow was going to bring. You didn't know what the case count was going to be, and there came quite a bit of, like, helplessness that went along with it. So I was sort of dealing with all that, and then the pandemic struck, and it was just almost too much.
And it was too much for some people, right? I mean, we
Very
saw
true. Yeah.
mental health spiral, and we're still
Hmm.
seeing that.
Yep.
And then we were assaulted by these horrific images in New York. And, kind of reminded me a little bit of 9/11, when we
Hmm.
were just assaulted by these images that were haunting.
Hmm.
And like you said, apocalyptic, right? Like, oh my God, we're all going to die. What's the point anyway? So you can
Yeah,
imagine.
well, and it was all sort of interrupted. It was all over the world as well, right? Like what was going on in Italy, where they were just, their healthcare was just absolutely overrun, But yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just yeah, it's true.
No, it was, and that's right. It was global. It was
Hmm.
it was a terrifying time. I mean, it was and eerie to go into grocery stores and see the long lines and see the mass. I mean, the whole thing was pretty surreal in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, yeah. At one point, you really start to think, are these doomsday preppers correct? Like, should I be shoring up toilet paper? Like, it was a very, very weird time, and lasted for, I mean, the bulk of that, like the really intense part of it, was what, a good 5 6 months where you just had no idea what was going on. And then slowly, I'm not sure how you guys were in the States, but here it was kind of weird, especially in Ontario. We did quite a bit of coming out of lockdowns, then half lockdowns, then color coded lockdowns, then strict complete lockdowns, then going back and forth almost a year and, I want to say, a half. It was really, really bad. So, there was also that, where, forget all the health implications and the angst of just, am I going to be okay? Am I going to end up on a respirator in 2 days from now? But also the financial pressure as well, right? Like, it's like, okay, well, I'm not working. I'm now relying on what the government is deeming to give me. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate all that they did, even though it seems like we're going to pay it back regardless, one way or another anyway. But just the fact that most people, I really, really find, need that sort of routine, that sort of purpose when it comes to going to work. And for a lot of people, that ends up being their main source of social interaction as well, right? So
Absolutely. And like I said, I mean, we just saw mental health issues skyrocket, and
yeah.
still seeing the after effects of that.
Hmm.
So let's talk about, let's circle back to you and your process. So you were not doing great before you had this one loss after another.
Mm.
COVID hits. What's going on for you at this point? What does what does that spiral look like for you on a personal level?
So I basically really, really just became reliant on drugs and alcohol. I mean, firstly, German descent. So my liver is already predisposed to, processing copious amounts of alcohol. So that was nothing new. And not only that, being a bartender, or just generally in the restaurant industry, we tend to have those type of maladies, like, dependency on alcoholism, that sort of thing. That just kind of got dialed up to 11, whereas I was drinking so much and it was so stupid. But I think the worst part about it was the almost shift in how I was. So I think the important distinction here is before I could have a night out drinking, big deal. I'm having a lot of fun. I'm a happy guy, or I'll come home and play video games or listen to music or something. But in this case, I just became so incredibly bitter, very, very interested in just not wanting to live anymore, not wanting to deal with it. I was a really, really crummy person to the people around me. I ended up, there was like a couple friends that, like, God bless them, stuck through me or stuck with me. But however, there was like, I lost one of my best friends, and to her credit, she stuck with me for a while, and she had absolutely no reason to. I don't blame it, but it was a real big difference from the type of person that I generally was. I guess the best way to describe it is, I've like I said, I've always kind of been a bit of a cynical person, especially leading up to this. But at this point, all the facade had just been lifted. I had absolutely no interest in trying to be even remotely hospitable anymore. I was just so pissed off and so bitter, and it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, for one, and two, like, well, you know how it is, right? With positivity usually begets positivity, and it works in reverse as well, where you're kind of when you're not happy and you're just putting storm clouds out into the world, you tend to sort of get that sort of same reception back.
Well, of course, we draw it to us, right? Whatever we focus on, we create more of.
Exactly, which in turn just makes you feel even worse and even more isolated. And it got so bad. It's actually weird because I don't talk about this very often. And now, oddly enough, I'm talking to you, who I've just met 20 minutes ago, and whoever happens to be listening. So it's a little bit of a weird sensation. But yeah, it's kind of one of those things that I don't mind talking about it, because it is just something that, I managed to sort of work through, and as I'm sure we'll get to, I'm much
We
better off
sure, we
now.
sure, we
Yeah,
sure, we
so
sure will. Let's
yeah.
talk about though I think that let me say a couple of things.
Mm,
Depression is the same side of a coin.
mm,
And we either internalize where people think of depression, where you don't want to get out of bed, or we
mm,
externalize and we're this like very angry human being. It can look like cynicism, for example.
mm.
It sounds to me you had a combination maybe of those two things. And
Certainly.
so when you talked about your lack of will to live, did you ever have an attempt on your own life?
At that point, no. What I did find was I talked about it quite often, which also didn't make the people around me particularly comfortable. And I'm to this day, I'm not. Funny enough, last night I was kind of just thinking over in my head of, like, this conversation, and kind of sort of playing out how it might go, and sort of trying to think back and sort of reflect on certain things. And that was one of them, where I was like, I think that the reason I talked about it so much was maybe to prevent myself from doing it. It was in some sort of twisted way, it was like kind of a replacement. But at the same time, what I certainly was doing was, with my, like, the amount of alcohol that I was drinking and coupling it with everything else, that was certainly, I was at a point where I was just kind of like, yeah, like, let's do this. Give me pancreatitis, give me liver cancer, give me cirrhosis, give me whatever. I don't care. So I was inviting it in that respect. But in terms of like an actual, let's say, bona fide, or even, I think you guys call it in the psychology, a suicidal gesture, I don't think there was even anything like that. It was just, it was more, I guess,
There was no plan, but if a bus runs me over, that's
yeah,
okay with me.
I'm not gonna get out of the way. And yeah, it was almost like I was playing the long game, because maybe I was too chicken to actually do it. And obviously I'm grateful for that, I guess. But yeah, no, there was no actual, like, I didn't try to do anything completely, let's say, final.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, I've been in this field for close to 30 years now, and I think about at some point, most of us, have fleeting thoughts of checking out, right? Because
Mm,
let's face it, living this life isn't for sissies.
you're
It's
absolutely
just
right.
not,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like, in
yeah.
order for us to grow and expand, and I think about that from a soul perspective, the way I think about the world and who we are, that we're here to grow and expand, and our deepest growth happens in our darkest hours. I really believe
Certainly.
that.
Yep.
And and so I think about, when people are, have suicide ideation, and they have a plan and they complete suicide, or they attempt and survive it.
Mm,
I from my understanding, it's not that people don't want to live anymore. They don't want to live with their pain anymore. And I think that that is a distinction of, when someone pulls the shade on our joy, on sunshine, and we are in a dark period for a long for days and then months at a time,
hmm
who wouldn't who would want to prolong their own suffering?
hmm
So the question always, where does hope live? Right? That's the deeper question. In mental
mm,
health, that's why people go seek treatment, right? Like trying to help people to move I think about it as moving or healing pain so that they can let joy in again, and they can
hmm
feel joy and experience joy. What was the turning point for you? Like, what changed? When did the shade start to, go up?
So, yeah, so to speak, it was kind of a few things that eventually led to a particular thing, which I guess kind of harkens back to the whole, positivity tends to just help you out in the long run. But it started basically with me just being dissatisfied with the person. Like, I always knew on a fundamental level that me being a crummy person and just being this morose individual 24/7 is not doing me any favors. So I knew that to begin with. So at some point, I guess I just sort of realized that, I had to take action, um, to get myself out of that funk. So it started with that, where I just kind of cut down on the drinking drastically. That was a
But
huge
but
step.
but what happened? Did you just wake up with this big light bulb? Did your friends say,
No,
"Hey, knock it off"? Did like,
there was no epiphany. I at that point I had already lost most of the friends. There was no epiphany. It was just a kind of a gradual sort of, well, I guess the best way that I can sort of describe it is, you go through, like, I'll give you an example. Long before this, I had a bit of a problem with drugs, and I hated it. I hated the person but I was addicted to it. And it was literally, there was like, I think I went through it for about 2 years. And half of that time, I was just not a fan of myself. So there was this like nagging sort of rankling thought that, like, okay, I got to stop this. 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 I find what I went through, pulling me out of this funk, was similar to that. I was still very sad, and even now to this day, there's quite a bit that still sort of bothers me. But knew for a fact, just again on a general level, that you can't sort of wallow. It's okay to be sad, and it's okay to be upset at certain things. But the fact that I was upset and I was wallowing was something that I realized is within my control. So it wasn't just like a quick sort of thing. It was sort of a gradual kind of thing of just doing these little steps, trying to be a happier person. It started like, where I would just be like, okay, I'm just going to get up and I'm going to force myself to like clean up around the house, or I'm going to force myself to start cooking again, and like get that sort of therapy in there where I can take it. And then eventually, what sort of the real like turning point after that was, as I mentioned to you earlier, I got a job opportunity Whereas before, I was just bartending, serving, doing cooking, doing some prep, like, something I could have done in my sleep at that point. I've been doing it for so long. In terms of, like, let's say, challenges, I had plateaued years and years ago. So I was never really happy with where I was. And fortunately, I lucked into an opportunity, and I was faced with a decision of whether I was just going to continue doing what I was doing and, just sort of for an indeterminate amount of time, or I was going to take this opportunity, which was out of my comfort zone and still is. I'm still dealing with challenges all the time, but I've learned to really, really appreciate those challenges, especially compared to having zero beforehand. So I took it, and it went from me all of a sudden, well, you're in the restaurant business, you know how it is. There's When you're a bartender or a server, all you really, really need to worry about is come in, deal with your tables, do your side duties, make sure you don't screw anything up, and you're good. Now, taking this GM position, I've got people under me. I've got to make sure that inventory is good. I've got to deal with representatives. I got to deal with head office. There is just now a myriad of things that I'm responsible for. And I could never, ever do what I'm doing now in the state that I was in. So that was kind of one of those where it's like, okay, you know what? I'm happy having people under me now and relying on me. And I've got a business now that is actually relying on me. If I go in and I start screwing everything up, that's going to screw my owner. That's going to screw the regulars. That's going to, So that was kind of the tipping point, and it's been uphill ever since.
Just for clarification, you had mentioned that I was in the restaurant business, and I
Mm.
just wanted to say for listeners that we have a restaurant, a pub, and a brewery, but really my husband is the one who runs it.
Okay,
I
sorry. I didn't mean to talk out of school or
No,
anything.
no,
I
no,
just,
no. I just wanted to clarify because because I hardly ever even have the opportunity to get into the pub. But I think that what you're
fair.
speaking to is it's about having purpose. And
Mm.
as human beings, I deeply believe we need to have a sense of purpose.
Yes.
And, I have a friend who had a significant stroke and was left with a disability of, it was really just energy. She didn't have the energy. And she said, when you say that,
Mm.
it really triggers me because I feel like, well, what is my purpose? Because I cannot serve people. And I said, serving people can look a lot of different ways. It can even be in prayer. We can
Mm.
be of service and have meaning even when we're in prayer for another human being. But it really
Mm.
is getting outside of ourselves, right? Because when we are hyper focused on ourselves, when depression, for example, we can feel like we're drowning in it because we're so self-absorbed in our own misery, really,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Yep.
And so some people get medication and do different things to help
Hmm.
them even deal with what is underlying that depression. But I think something that you said, which is really interesting, it's only gone uphill from there because once you have this sense of purpose, and for you, it happened to be, in the world that you were used to being in,
Hmm.
where you were given and offered this opportunity that was a growth opportunity professionally, right? Because you had
Yep.
never been a GM before, but
Never even a
also,
manager. Yeah.
yeah. Also, now a lot of people are relying on you. So you're like, I can't drink till 2 o'clock in the morning and wake up hungover. And like, so there was a motivator for you
Hmm.
because now you're showing up for somebody other than yourself.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
that in and of itself can be enough to help people start to see their own value. Because I think also when we are depressed, I definitely went through a bout of deep depression after my brother died. That when we are there, it is difficult to see our own worth.
Hmm.
And I think that's the spiraling. When we lose a sense of self-worth, we don't see how we are of any purpose to anybody, including
Hmm.
ourselves. And so then you start to spiral down. But the first place, it seemed like it started with you before you got this job offer, that it was some understanding that you did not want to live this way anymore.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. And again, when you start, it was pretty obvious. Like, when you're at that sort of point, or at least when I was anyway, you could see yourself acting in this horrific manner, and you wake up feeling like crap and being like, oh, man, like literally I'd be like checking my phones being like, okay, what kind of like, how did I message this person this time, and how was I a jerk today, and like, you know what I mean, and you knew, so it was obvious. It was just a matter of not wanting that, but it becomes incredibly difficult to sort of change, because at that point, well, not only was there just that like physical dependency on it, and some mental dependency on it as well, but as you say, life is sometimes very often tough, and it's not for everybody, but a lot of people do go that way, where they just sort of give up on stuff and just succumb to drugs or alcohol, is because it's easier. It's way easier, right? And one of the testaments to that is when I did just kind of knock the alcohol on the head and kind of just go back at it sober. I had to sort of face a lot of the stuff that I was placing this big gigantic band-aid over, right? And I had to sort of learn to be sad, and sometimes be bitter, but not let that crumble me, and also just to kind of get reintroduced to myself, because I had just simply lost myself over that course of it. And again, we had a very huge sort of family dynamic, which started to wane when my mom passed away. We had just a lot of family traditions and that sort of thing. And then, so when I started losing a lot of my family members, it really, really felt like I was losing a huge piece of myself each time. Right. So by the time all of this was kind of in its full swing, I truly didn't recognize myself anymore. I really didn't. And of course, I just wasn't doing myself any favors either. Right. So, but yeah, to your point, it was definitely just a fundamental understanding that I didn't want to continue on this way. It's not the type of person I am, generally speaking. And, nobody wants to be that person that is just constantly bitter, constantly negative, because, for good reason, not very many people want to be around you. Right. So,
I was just going to say that. I mean, I think that, my mantra kind of has always been you need to leave people better off than how you found them. And
mm,
that's not to say that when we're sad or when we're hurting, that we can't bring that to a good friend and be able to have those conversations, or a therapist or a
mm,
pastor or wherever. It's cleaning up our own backyard, as I like to say, and being
yeah.
aware of that. Like, I need to take care of this, because then what we
Mm,
do is we walk into a room and we don't have to open our mouth, but we can spew really negative energy into a room that has an impact on others, even though we can't
yeah.
see it with our eyes.
Mm,
But it's absolutely true. I mean, that's why therapists always have to go to supervision. So they are making sure that they are dealing with their stuff so it does not get in the way of the
mm,
work that they're doing with families or other human beings. I mean,
sure.
it's just true. We all have
Yeah.
energy, we have aura, we have energy fields. And
Mm,
so I love this conversation, because I think that when we get to a point where we're tired of our own self, right, that's a really nice indicator that it's time to do something to clean up our own backyard and
yeah.
really
Yeah.
deal with whatever is underlying our unhappiness, right? What
Mm,
is it that's at the core? And like I said, sometimes it requires people to see a psychiatrist and get on some
mm,
medication to begin that journey. It is different for everyone.
certainly.
Um,
Yeah.
but I appreciate all of these different things that you are talking about, because I also know that things don't happen overnight. It's not like you woke up, said, yeah, I don't want to be this way anymore, you got a new job, and then all of a sudden you are,
Yeah.
it's all rainbows and skittles.
Mm,
so
yeah.
so talk
Uh,
to us. I mean, I'm watching the time and we have about 10 minutes, but can you talk to
mm,
us about that steady
incline per se.
incline? Yeah,
Mm.
exactly. What that looked like for you, kind of coming out of this dark period of your life.
So it was I think of the best, sort of way to describe it. Certainly at sometimes it was like, walking across gravel on your knees. And then sometimes you would get this like glimmer of something where and it started really small. Like, I was a good example was I was into cooking before this, right? Now I'm well on my way, but that was one of those things that I kind of use because I had always found it a little bit therapeutic. And to me, I find cooking kind of one of those things where it's fun. Food helps bring people together for another. It's a great opportunity to learn. And it's also a good opportunity to kind of give you confidence boosts every once in a while. So I would find, for example, where like you would have a bunch of crappy things happen, or I would just, go a week where I just kind of feel crummy. But then I would get a chance and I would try out a new recipe. And then, I would maybe not nail it, but it would be really, really good. And that would be like, okay, you know what? And that would motivate me and inspire me to try the next thing, right? And then next thing I know, over the course of, let's say, however many months, I was like, okay, I'm getting pretty good at this. I'm enjoying it now. And that almost imperceptibly had this kind of ray of joy that was just kind of sort of peeking through all the darkness. And over time, those rays just kind of get bigger and stronger, and the darkness, dissipates slowly. But it definitely, yeah, it definitely wasn't an easy or quick process. It took quite a bit of willpower, because especially at the beginning, there was a lot of times where I was just like, okay, I don't want to do this. I want to just get back and, like, I'm going to go to the liquor store. I'm going to, you know what I mean? So there was an element of willpower involved. But as I got sort of better and started feeling better, it just sort of had sort of an exponential effect. And I was able to, kind of open up more happiness and positive things. And then, next thing you know, people are starting to act differently around me, and I'm starting to, you know what I mean? So that all just kind of became a cumulative kind of thing. And you get to the point pretty quickly where you recognize what's happening. So then, it's similar to, let's say, when you're working out and you just start to see results, right? And then you're like, oh, I'm kind of starting to look a little good. I kind of want to keep going at this, right? So it's similar to that. Yeah.
And yeah, I think that that's a perfect analogy because it's really hard at first and it takes a lot of
Mm-hmm.
motivation to keep those workouts going when it hurts and you don't have the energy maybe and you have a long way to go. And listen, I wish that I could remember this person's name because it was very powerful. It stayed with me after all of these years because it has to have been at least 20 years since I heard this. He was a life coach and he was doing a webinar and he said one of the reasons that people let their dreams fall away is because they can't hold the present and their dream at the same time because it feels like such a long road and they have
Mm,
no idea of how they're going to get from the present to this dream that can sometimes feel lofty, and so it
yeah.
falls away. And and I think that you know it's so cliche, but you have to start with that very first step. And it's just true with anything in life, whatever goal, you have to start with a step. And so I was thinking with you, here you are in this dark place and you're offered really this gift, this job out of the
Mm-hmm.
blue that you weren't
Mm-hmm.
expecting.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a moment where you thought, no way can I do this job? Why are they even asking?
Many,
Like, yeah, like
many. Yeah.
what gave you the courage to say yes? Because a GM role, there's a lot of responsibility with a general
Yeah,
manager.
so to sort of explain how it worked, and it was actually incredibly random and serendipitous, but we had had a brief sort of respite in the lockdowns, and where at this time in Ontario, restaurants were allowed to open, but patio only. So me and a couple buddies were like, you know what? Okay, we got a chance. Let's go out for a beer. And we usually go over to, like, we have our spot. And it just so happened that one of my buddies, he called before and he was like, you know what? My dad just went to this place. He really likes the food. Why don't we go there instead? Give it a try. So I was like, all right, awesome. Why not? Right? Let's try it. So I went, and I ended up meeting a regular of mine that I had been serving forever. Now he had left, like he stopped going to the place that I was currently working at, and now he was a regular over at this new place. And we started talking, and he was like, "Listen, I know the owner. He just had a kid. He's looking for somebody to kind of fill in his role." So just to be clear, the owner of the place that I'm working on now, incredibly hands-on, like incredibly. He is in there in the trenches with all of us. He's one of those guys that he's washing dishes. He's amazing. But you just have a kid. He had thoughts of opening up another restaurant, so he was looking for somebody to sort of fill in that role, somebody that he can rely on. And despite all my, wallowing, let's say, at work, it was a little bit different because you have to kind of always put your best foot forward, at least as best as you can. Otherwise, you're not going to get any tips, right? Nobody's going to want to come in for a beer and be served by this like stormy cloud, right? So he knew that I was a good server. He knew that I was in the restaurant biz for a long time. So he was like, listen, like, I know you. I think you would be a good fit here. Why don't you just talk to him? So I talked to him and I hit it off pretty well. But my immediate thought was like, yeah, no, I'm not going to do this. And what I did was I just told him, I'm like, okay, well, let's see what happens with COVID. At that point, we were thinking maybe it was going to start getting back to normal. Little did we know. But I was like, why don't we just kind of give me a little bit, and then I'll come by with my resume. And I just kind of was like, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to stick at home, or stick where I'm at. And then he ended up calling me. He got my number from the regular and was like, hey, we spoke, like, are you going to come in and bring in your resume? So I was like, okay, well, this guy, seems to really, really want me to at least give me a shot. So I'm like, you know what? And it took like maybe 2 or 3 days of me just seriously thinking about it. And yeah, I came to that conclusion where I was like, look, I could just go out of my comfort zone and just give this a shot. And I think what really sealed the deal is I'm kind of getting into an age where I'd rather regret things I do than regret things I don't do. So I could see myself not taking the opportunity and then just being so mad at myself for not doing it. So I was like, all right, let's do it. Gave it a try. It was pretty hard at the beginning because there's just, well, there's a lot to take on. There's a lot now, especially, I was in the middle of mostly a lockdown. So I was, what, 6 months sitting on my tuchus. And then all of a sudden I'm now having to work like 6 days a week, learning this, learning that, got staff under me, right? Get going. So it was tough. And there was many times where I was not entirely convinced that I was going to make it, but I stuck it out. And then now I'm in such a good position. And for the last little bit, especially now with COVID sort of mostly in the rear view mirror and the labor force starting to sort of get back to normal, sort of supply chains are sort of starting to equalize. It's the best thing really that I felt in a very, very long time. So
I'm so happy for you. I
yeah.
know we just met today, but I'm
Well,
so
thank
happy.
you.
I'm so happy for you. I can actually feel your joy through
Yeah.
Zoom.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I think that is wonderful. All right, we are now at the top of the hour, so I want to ask you what
Mm,
I ask everyone at the end of this podcast.
mm.
Um, what does self-love look like for you now?
Oh, I was not prepared for this question. You did not prepare me for this question. It's a very good question, though. So I would say a lot of it, at least for me, is getting kind of stoked about challenges that are coming up that I now know I'm equal to the task. And whenever I sort of nail something at work or something really goes my way, I guess to sum it up, I've found a way to be proud of myself. And at first, it was a very different sensation, but now I recognize it for what it is. And especially when you have to be a leader, you can't be second guessing yourself all the time. You have to be very, very sort of, streamlined in your way of thinking. And then that's not to say that I'm always right. The way I operate is I always want to hear suggestions, recommendations, and that sort of thing. We've sort of kind of created a very, very inclusive sort of vibe at work where we're all just sort of coming up with ideas, and because it's now a family. So yeah, I think that I'm now really, really part of something. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I should be and I deserve to be part of something. And I'm a good asset into that whole thing. So yeah, that's self-love to me. I'm learning to be proud of what I'm doing and where I'm at.
That is just beautiful. You just made me think of something that I think that when we get depressed or lack that sense of self-worth, we stop trusting ourselves. And it sounds like what you've moved into around self-love is trusting yourself again.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
that,
very much so.
and I don't know, I don't think there's anything more powerful than when we can trust ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for that. Is there anything else you want to say to listeners that I didn't ask you or that you didn't say?
I think maybe the only thing that I just do find rather important is that we didn't cover is I think, and you probably agree, I think a sense of perspective also goes a long way. That was one thing also that thankfully I've always kind of been capable of. But it's sometimes really behooves ourselves to kind of look just out and be like, yeah, you know what, I'm sad for this reason, or I wish things were a little bit better. But you got to look at like all the good things that you actually do have. And when you really think about it, we are tremendously privileged to, live where we are, to be able to, like I've got my health. I'm able to go to work. I'm able to make some money if I want to. If I want to just go and binge buy DVDs on Amazon, I can. If I can go to the beer store, or sorry, not the beer store. I can go to the grocery store and buy some chicken or something. I don't need to scavenge. There's quite a lot, that I've learned to be grateful for, and that has also helped me to not be so hyper focused on the negative.
Thank you for that.
Mm.
Yeah, it's the power of gratitude. There's tons of research on it now too, right? So we know that gratitude also begets gratitude. And,
Mm-hmm.
there's a wonderful book out there. I can't remember the title of it right now, but the analogy is when you're on the dance floor, sometimes you need to get up on the stage to look at things from a different perspective. And I think about that in terms of our own life, that you
Mm-hmm.
need to take a step back, as you said, and sort of observe your own self.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it broadens our perspective because, that saying, fish are the last to discover water, that when we're in something and we're so in
Yeah.
it that we can't see anything else. And so
Seeing the trees despite the forest.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Nick, thank you so much for the time that you have spent in sharing your story with us. I am always so honored by the courage that it takes, I think, to come on a platform like this and
Mm.
you don't know me and to sort of, open your heart wide and share this experience with all of us. So thank you
Well,
very much for
to
that.
to your credit, you made it very, very comfortable and easy. So I
Oh,
appreciate that. So
oh, good. Okay, listeners, thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate you. I love you. And again, I hope that Nick's story today has given you some spark or hope if that's what you need in your life right now. So we'll see you guys here all next week. Bye for now.